Hello everybody, this is Mark Maritato, military historical artist. Thank you for joining me once again for the second video in this series depicting the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863, while they are in the midst of their famous charge to stop Cadmus Wilcox's Alabama Brigade in order to save the Union Center from being rolled back. And before we get started, folks, if you would not mind, please liking the video, consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share the video out and click on the notification bell to get notifications of future videos. We are trying to get to 1,000 subscribers so that we could bring more of this type of content to you. If you're interested in getting updates on what I'm working on, please feel free to visit my social media sites. I have a Facebook page and an Instagram page that I'm always updating, and you can get the latest information on what I'm working on either of those sites. I left some links in the description of this video with some historical information about the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment and their action at the Battle of Gettysburg. Feel free to check those out at your leisure. Also, if you would like to go back and watch the first video in this series, you can find it in the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg playlist on this channel. The first 3 minutes of this video are going to be in real time, and then it will speed up to a time lapse. I just did this to give you an idea of how slowly and methodically I work through these paintings as I'm working, to give you kind of an idea of how much time it actually takes to kind of go through and paint through some of these figures. It's actually kind of interesting once you go back and look at it yourself. You don't realize exactly how much time you're spending working on these different figures. So here we are again, folks, just blocking in colors where they need to be at the very basic beginning point of the process of building this painting up. I am now laying in colors and shapes where they need to be, just in a very rough fashion. The feeling of having to create a painting like this is very daunting at this point because you're just at the very beginning stages of it. There's so much to do, there's so much to add, but really the only way to get through it is to just work on it and plug through it and put in the hours that are required for a painting like this to be done. As the painting progresses, you will see it develop more and more into its final form, but getting there is a really tedious and long road. So that's why documenting this painting had to be done in a series of videos, because you just can't capture all the long hours of work that have gone into this into one short 1-hour video. So far, what you're seeing is about 8 hours of work just to get to this point. I would like to elaborate further on a concept that I mentioned in my previous video, where I spoke about how I work on the background elements first and then work my way forward. Starting with the background elements such as the sky, the next element that I would normally work on would be the background landscape, and then further towards the foreground would be the figures or the soldiers that would make up the main characters in my scene, up to any elements that are in the foreground. Now, normally, as a matter of perspective, anything that would appear in the furthest background would appear highest on the plane in the painting, and then anything moving forward would go lower and lower and lower on the picture plane as it moved forward. So the sky you would see in the very background would be the highest element in the painting. The background landscape would be the middle elements in the painting, as well as the figures that would make up the story. And then any figures that would occupy the closest plane to the viewer would occupy the lowest part of the picture plane. The reason why you want to work from the background element to the foreground element is because it's easier to work that way and create a sense of realism. It's a lot harder to paint a figure or an element in the foreground first and then have to paint around it and have to paint the sky and the background around any figures that you've painted in the middle and the foreground first. I mean, I've seen artists do it that way, but it's not really the easiest way to do it, and sometimes you might run into some problems with trying to achieve the level of realism you want to achieve by doing that. So my recommendation would always be to work from the furthest element first, which would be the sky, and then come forward and work with the closest foreground element or figure last. Otherwise, I think you're kind of just fighting against yourself with creating something in the foreground and having to try to have to work around it and move to elements in the background. When you layer elements from the back to the front, you get a better sense of layering in the picture plane as you move forward, and you don't get any kind of weird edges and things like that that would maybe throw the viewer off when they're looking at your artwork in its final form. So at this point, you could see that I've blocked in about half of the figures so far, working from left to right. The reason why I work from left to right is actually a couple different reasons. The first reason is because I'm right-handed and I'm working on an oil painting, it kind of helps to work from left to right so that you can rest your hand on a dry part of the painting and not worry about smearing any paint as you're moving along. The second reason is because, again, as I had mentioned previously, I'm working from the background elements up to the foreground elements and also judging my values of my color tones as I'm moving forward. So I'm constantly looking and checking to see what needs to be lighter, what needs to be darker, what items and elements need to be certain colors as I move along. Now, because this is going to be a sunset piece, a lot of the colors are going to be kind of dramatic. So there's going to be a lot of deep shadows and also a lot of pretty bright lighting effects that are going to be taking place in this painting as it moves along. So that's also going to add to the drama and the realism of this piece as it moves forward. My hope is the final piece will be a very dramatically lit piece with some deep shadows in the foreground to kind of frame in the viewer, to have them looking at the soldiers as they're charging towards the viewer. One of the other reasons why I chose this composition is other paintings that have been done on the 1st Minnesota usually have them charging away from the viewer of the painting. I've not seen any other painting that I know of that show the regiment charging pretty much at the viewer as I'm going to be showing it here. So I think this might set my painting a little bit apart from what has been done in the past, because this is a very well-known and historic and heroic regiment that fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. They've had quite a few paintings done of them and done of this action, but I've not seen a painting where the men are coming at the viewer like this would be. So my hope is that, this painting will honor the men of the 1st Minnesota Regiment and what they've done in their final act of sacrifice and to save the Union battle line on the evening of July 2nd, 1863. group of men in the middle of the painting behind the officer in the foreground are the color guard. The color guard was tasked with carrying the colors of the regiment. So there would be a sergeant that would be in charge of carrying the flag, and that sergeant would be flanked by corporals whose main duty was to just guard the flag. They were not allowed to fire their muskets or even aim their muskets at anyone unless the flag was threatened. So normally there would be a sergeant for each flag that was carried depending on how many flags the regiment had. Some regiments had one, as in the case with the 1st Minnesota. Some regiments had 2 flags. There would be a national flag, which would be a stars and stripes American flag, and then there would be a regimental flag. Usually it would be a state color or a color that would be emblematic of the regiment, something that would have been designed to honor the regiment's history. In a lot of cases, say like the Irish Brigade would carry a green flag as part of their Irish heritage, and then they would carry a state regimental color with them as well in some cases, not in all cases. But each regiment was different and each regiment carried different flags, and the color guard were just tasked with guarding the flag. The corporals on each side of the sergeant were ordered to habitually carry their muskets at shoulder arms, which means they're carrying them by their side, not being allowed to aim or use their muskets to even fire at the enemy unless the flag was being imminently threatened. As you can imagine, this duty was very highly honored within the regiment, but it was also one of the most dangerous duties in the regiment, as the flags were conspicuous targets for the enemy to be shooting at. But it was considered to be an honor to be part of the color guard, and you had to be specifically chosen to conduct that duty. The regimental colors or flags during the Civil War of a particular regiment were basically the heart and soul of the regiment, which was the iconic, emblematic representation of the regiment itself. The reason why Civil War regiments carried flags was during the time of the Civil War, many of the armies were still using Napoleonic style fighting techniques that were adopted from European armies. And a lot of these European armies used flags to identify which regiments were on the field during a particular battle and any particular battlefield. And when these colors were going forward, they were showing the general who was in the back overseeing the action on the field. They would be able to tell which regiment was going forward and which regiment was going back. Because don't forget, during this time, gunpowder was very dirty at this time, and when a gun fired, it would fill the air with all this white smoke, and when you have thousands of muskets going off at once, the air would immediately be filled with white smoke. But usually the regimental flags would be sticking up over this smoke and showing commanders who were on the field where their regiments were at any given time. The other role that the flags played was that if the soldier in a regiment saw his flag going forward, he was expected to go forward with that flag. If the flag was going back, he would then be allowed with honor to fall back with that flag, which meant that the regiment was falling back. And that would be really the only time that the soldier would be allowed and expected to fall back with that flag. Each soldier was part of a machine that protected those flags. If the color guard was decimated and the entire color guard was shot down, the individual private would be expected to drop his gun and pick up that flag and go forward. That's how important these flags were during this time. So the regimental colors in the American armies during the 19th century served 2 major roles. The first role was for battlefield communication, and the second role was for serving as the actual identity as well as the source of esprit de corps within the individual regiment itself. Alright folks, I guess that's enough yapping for me for one video. I'm going to let the video play out. If you have any questions about the painting, about the history of the 1st Minnesota, or if you have any questions about my technique or anything like that, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. I'll be happy to answer them as soon as I possibly can, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. folks, we've reached the end of another video. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch. If you're interested in seeing a portfolio of all of my artwork, you can visit my website at maritato.com. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.